Our country is being invaded. The invasion has been going on for some time, and it's happening as a direct result of the policies of Joe Biden and his Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Today, I'll explain how the Biden administration is violating our immigration laws and engineering a humanitarian and national security crisis on our southern border, and why it's grounds for impeachment. Plus, in our deep dive segment, Ukraine is corrupt and autocratic. A partial Ukrainian loss is not going to lead to a Russian invasion of Europe because Russia is a weak and declining power. It's time to push for an end to the war and refocus our resources on the real threats to America and the free world, like the CCP and the Mexican drug cartels. All that plus behind the headlines on today's episode of Founding Principles with me, your host, Doug Wardlow.
A battle for the fate of America rages. The radical left seeks to destroy the very foundations of our republic. God, the family, and the Constitution are under attack. Amidst the chaos, Doug Wardlow speaks truth and points the way back to freedom. It is time to go on offense. This is Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
Consider this number, 2,378,000. That's the number of illegal immigrants that crossed our border in fiscal year 2022 alone. Just think about that. That number is larger than the population of 15 different states. And the numbers of illegal migrants are increasing fast. The number of illegal immigrants crossing the southern border in fiscal 2022 was up from the already sky-high figure of more than 1.7 million illegal migrants who crossed the southern border the prior year. That's an increase of around 650,000, or 27% in a single year. In the last month, however, the crisis at the border has reached truly epic proportions. Indeed, in the first 20 days of September alone, more than 140,000 migrants flooded across our southern border, and that does not include migrants who evaded detection by Border Patrol. Just think about that. Projecting that figure out for the entire month, that equates to 210,000 illegal migrants crossing the border in September alone. But even that figure, which if annualized represents illegal immigrant border crossings at a rate of over 2.5 million migrants per year, understates the true extent of the problem. That's because that number and all the other numbers I've discussed so far represent the number of immigrants actually encountered by U.S. border agents at the southern border. And the vast majority of those illegal migrants were released into the interior of the United States, by the way. The numbers don't include the number of illegal migrants that got away from authorities while crossing the border or were just not detected at all. U.S. border agents recently confirmed that the number of so-called gotaways during the first 2 years of the Biden administration is around 1.2 million. And that's just the known gotaways, not the ones that evaded detection completely. When you look at all the numbers, including gotaways and actual migrant encounters, the total number of illegal immigrants who have crossed the southern border during the Biden presidency to date is well over 6 million. There are some sources that say it could be as much as 10 million migrants. Well, 6 million, that's about as many people as live in the entire Atlanta metropolitan area, or the entire state of Missouri, or the entire state of Maryland. So yes, with those kinds of numbers, there can't really be any dispute. This is an invasion. And with increased illegal immigration comes more crime as well. According to Customs and Border Protection statistics, illegal immigrants committed 1,178 assault and domestic violence crimes in 2021. And that was a more than 400% increase from the prior year. Now, you might hear some people on the left argue that illegal immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than legal residents. That's a ridiculous argument for two reasons. First, it can take years for a state to identify convicts who are in prison or otherwise in custody as illegal immigrants. As a result, studies on crime rates, to which leftists like to point, misclassify a significant number of criminal offenders as legal residents who are only later identified as illegal immigrants. Second, and this point is rather obvious, an illegal immigrant has no legal right to be in the country. An illegal immigrant who commits a crime in this country would not have committed the crime in the United States if the border and our immigration laws were strictly enforced. So every single crime committed by an illegal immigrant inside the United States is a crime that should not have happened and would not have happened if the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas were following our immigration laws and enforcing the border. And then there's the staggering cost of illegal immigration, a burden that taxpayers are forced to bear. Let's just take a look at one state to get a sense of the magnitude of this problem. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton estimated that the cost of services that Texas provides to unlawfully present aliens is at least $855 million per year. That includes millions for uncompensated health care, housing, the cost of emergency Medicaid programs, education costs, and more. And that's just one state. But here's something far more disturbing. Statistics suggest that terror organizations are attempting to take advantage of our non-existent southern border. Apprehensions of people who are on the terror watch list at the southern border rose from fewer than 10 annually during the Trump presidency to 98 in 2022. 98. Well, that's a lot of terrible news. But guess what? All signs are that the rate of illegal crossings is still increasing. That is, the problem is getting worse every single day. According to Breitbart News, on Tuesday, 1,500 mostly Venezuelan migrants entered the small border town of Eagle Pass, Texas, during that single evening. The migrants surrendered to authorities, fully expecting that they'd be paroled and released into the interior of the United States. That group of migrants on Tuesday brings the 8-day total of migrant crossings at that single border town, Eagle Point, to 16,000. 16,000 in 8 days. According to Breitbart, that is far above the rate of migrants that crossed the border during the infamous immigration surge involving mostly Haitian migrants in Del Rio in September of 2021. But it's not just one border town or even one sector of the southwestern border that is seeing a flood of migrant crossings. No, not at all. It's happening across the entire border. In Arizona, Tucson sector Border Patrol agents apprehended approximately 11,000 migrants during the past week alone, according to Sector Chief Patrol Agent John Modlin. On X, formerly Twitter, the Tucson sector chief posted that number and further reported that the week saw 15 human smuggling events and 6 narcotics events. And that is just in the Tucson sector. According to Breitbart News, the Tucson Chief Modlin, warned migrants that illegally crossing between ports of entry could result in arrest, removal, and a ban on re-entry. That is, he's saying that migrants, if they cross illegally, they could be arrested, they could be removed, there could be a ban on re-entry. Well, the facts on the ground, in particular the huge releases of migrants into the interior by Border Patrol agents, that contradicts the Tucson sector chief's statement. The migrants know that they won't be removed, and they know they're not going to be arrested. They know they're going to just be released into the country. And get this, the 16,000 migrants who crossed near Eagle Point, Texas last week were so determined to enter the United States illegally that they crossed the border despite the heavy presence of state law enforcement, local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, members of the Texas National Guard, and in addition to all of that, layers of razor wire. Such huge numbers of migrants would not travel from Venezuela all the way to the United States border at Eagle Point and then cross the border illegally, despite all those barriers, unless they had been assured that they would be admitted into the United States. They wouldn't make such a dangerous trip unless they had been convinced that the United States would not enforce its own immigration laws, but rather would simply release them into the country upon their surrender to U.S. officials on the U.S. side of the border. Indeed, the migrants are so convinced that the United States has given up on doing anything to prevent migrants from entering the United States that a group of them decided to claim a small piece of U.S. territory for Venezuela. Texas DPS spokesman Lieutenant Chris Olivares posted a video on X showing a Venezuelan flag planted by migrants on a small island in the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass, Texas, on the U.S. side of the border. Let's watch. So as you just saw, Texas officials quickly responded and took down the Venezuelan flag. So how did all these migrants come to be so convinced that they can just enter the United States with impunity, with no fear of removal? How did they come to believe that the United States has essentially given up on protecting its own sovereignty? Well, that's what Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have been telling would-be migrants since Biden assumed office. It's the message being sent by Mayorkas when he organizes multiple programs to parole huge numbers of migrants into the country. It's the message being sent by the Biden administration's CBP One app. It's an app that allows would-be asylum seekers to schedule an appointment using the app to meet officials at the border and then be released into the United States. And it's the very, 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 very loud message being sent when every single day U.S. border officials release massive numbers of illegal border crossers into the United States. People who have crossed illegally between ports of entry and then surrendered themselves to U.S. officials. Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas have intentionally created a huge and unprecedented crisis on the southern border. A border crisis, a sovereignty crisis, a drug crisis, a national security crisis, and a humanitarian crisis. And they have done it by wantonly ignoring and breaking the immigration laws of the United States. They have betrayed the trust of the American people, broken our laws, and created a catastrophe. They have violated their oaths of office by conspiring to break and to nullify the immigration laws of the United States. And for doing these things, both Mayorkas and Biden should be impeached and removed from office. But let's take a look at just exactly how Biden and Mayorkas have broken, ignored, and undermined the immigration laws of the United States. Essentially, Mayorkas, at the behest of the president, has orchestrated a system of processing and releasing illegal immigrants into the United States instead of detaining them and removing them as the law requires. Biden and Mayorkas treat all border crossers and prospective entrants as refugees or asylum seekers, even though they know that the vast majority are not fleeing persecution and are not eligible for asylum under U.S. law. Section 212D5A of the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the INA, provides that parole, that is, the release of aliens seeking admission to our country, can only be done temporarily and, quote, only on a case-by-case basis for urgent humanitarian reasons or significant public benefit, close quote. Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden have violated this section of the INA by directing the Department of Homeland Security to parole illegal aliens into the United States en masse, not on a case-by-case basis, but en masse for no humanitarian reason at all, and contrary to the good of the public in general, as opposed to paroling aliens on a case-by-case basis for humanitarian reasons that are urgent. Simply put, the law requires that parole entry for asylum seekers or refugees can only be granted one illegal alien at a time, and only after DHS has made a determination that there is an urgent humanitarian reason to grant parole in the case of that individual alien, based on the circumstances particular to that individual alien. Releasing huge numbers of illegal border crossers into the United States violates the law, and the Biden administration can't excuse its violation of the law by labeling all entrants as asylum seekers and calling their release into the United States parole. The DHS policy of pre-registering aliens outside the United States for mass entry and release through ports of entry using various programs created by DHS and through the CBP-1 app violates the law for the exact same reason. Asylum determinations and parole must be done on a case-by-case basis under the law. Now, the Biden administration has also violated Section 212D5B of the INA. That section of the INA provides that the administration, quote, may not parole into the United States an alien who is a refugee unless they determine that compelling reasons in the public interest with respect to that particular alien require that the alien be paroled into the United States rather than be admitted as a refugee. Now, the United States has a well-established program for vetting refugees before they are admitted into the United States. But rather than send potential refugees through the program for vetting, the Biden administration and DHS Secretary Mayorkas are simply admitting illegal border crossers en masse and calling them refugees or asylum seekers. But the law does not allow that. The law clearly and unambiguously states that an alien cannot be paroled into the United States unless there is a compelling reason with respect to the individual alien to parole the alien into the United States as opposed to vetting the alien as a refugee through the well-established refugee program. And that's not all. There is yet another clear violation of our immigration laws being perpetrated by the Biden administration. Section 235B1 of the INA provides that any alien attempting to enter the United States who does not have a visa or other proper immigration papers must be screened at the border and must be removed unless the alien states that they want to apply for asylum, in which case they must be referred to an asylum officer for an interview. The asylum officer must order the removal of the alien without hearing unless the officer determines that the alien has a well-founded fear of persecution. At that point, and only at that point, the alien may seek review of the asylum officer's determination by an immigration judge. But as the alien awaits the outcome of the review by an immigration judge, the alien must be detained. Section 235B1B of the INA, titled Mandatory Detention, states in no uncertain terms that the alien, quote, shall be detained pending a final determination of credible fear of persecution and, if found not to have such a fear, until removed. That is, the law is very clear that aliens seeking asylum must indicate that they are seeking asylum upon being screened at the border, that they must be then interviewed by an asylum officer, that they must be removed from the United States unless the interviewing asylum officer finds that they have a credible fear of persecution, and that an alien must be detained while awaiting review by an immigration judge of the asylum officer's determination. Detention is mandatory. The statutory scheme clearly allows no room whatsoever for DHS to label everyone who shows up at the border as an asylum seeker and then just refuse to detain them and release them into the United States, which is what they're doing now. So there are three different ways that the Biden Department of Homeland Security is violating our immigration laws. The Biden administration's policies are lawless, and the result is a massive national security and humanitarian crisis at our southern border. Mexican drug cartels are expanding their operational control of huge swaths of our border, even as they boost their ability to push their poison into our country, leading to the deaths of scores of Americans every day. Terrorists are entering the country. Human trafficking is skyrocketing. Deaths at the border are skyrocketing. In fiscal year 2022, 853 aliens died at the border. That's up from the prior year's record of 546 deaths. For refusing to follow the law, orchestrating the nullification of all of our immigration laws, undermining our national security, creating a humanitarian crisis, and knowingly encouraging a massive infringement of our nation's sovereignty, both President Joe Biden and Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas deserve to be impeached. The fact of the matter is that all of this is being done by design and with a sinister purpose. You see, the radical left wants to erase their border and destroy our country's sovereignty. The left wants to illegally import left-wing voters. And the left wants to undermine our laws, undermine the Constitution, and undermine any and all limits on government power, so that the left can build its elite-dominated socialist dystopia on top of the ruins of our once proud society of free individuals and strong families. So let's hope and pray that House Republicans have the courage to use all the tools at their disposal, including the power of the purse and the power of impeachment, to put a stop to this madness once and for all. We are very honored to be coming to you on Lindell TV, but if you're watching on any other platform, whether it's Rumble or YouTube or what have you, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like the video, drop a comment into the comment section. Doing each of those things helps us tremendously, and if you're listening to the audio podcast, give us a 5-star rating. All those things help us grow and multiply the impact of the show. So now it's time for Behind the Headlines. First up today, Philadelphia, as you probably all know, has endured its second straight night of mass looting. Breitbart News has done a good job compiling several videos showing the extent of the looting. It's absolutely terrible. But whether it's liquor, iPhones, or a nice pair of Nike shoes, these hooligan looters seem to be making out quite nicely. During the George Floyd riots right here in my home state of Minnesota, and then across the country, we saw looting in basically every major city in the United States. Crime apologists like AOC, they have said that the looters were merely disadvantaged folks who were simply stealing bread for their families. Well, one might well sympathize with a poor man stealing essentials for his family. Stealing is never okay, of course, but one could at least understand the motivation to steal in desperate circumstances if one's family is nearing starvation. At least you could understand that. Reality, however, continues to be AOC and the left's biggest enemy, because the looters are not trying to feed starving families. They are not desperate. When Apple stores, Gucci, and Nike are being looted, it's hard to imagine what life necessities these desperate folks are bringing home for those families. It's much more likely, indeed it's certainly true, that the looters are low-life criminals who prey on the hardworking members of society. Now, Philadelphia is a Democrat stronghold, like most major cities in the country. Many people in the area directly voted for this. They voted for Democrats who are soft on crime. They voted for the chaos and the lawlessness that the Democrats endorse. To that extent, then, voters are, at least in part, responsible for the madness. To restore order, we must be willing to fight back. We must enforce the law. This is not rocket science. We must enforce the law. We must make sure there are consequences for breaking the law. Again, this is very simple. We need to use the law to teach would-be criminals that breaking the law will land them in prison, that there are consequences when you do it. That's the only path back to sane and safe civilization. All right, second up today. The Republican JV team had its second debate. I watched just parts of it, and wow, it was interesting, I guess you could say. Fox News has really fallen, is the big takeaway. They are not what they once were. Luckily, patriots all across the country have alternative media that they are able to turn to, including this show right here. Some of the candidates on that stage, they did fine. DeSantis had a particularly strong performance. He clearly outclassed everybody else on the stage. He's done great things in Florida. He's actually a true conservative. DeSantis is actually a true conservative, and he's been tested in Florida. He's done things that are very impressive, and he also turned Florida red. So Ron DeSantis is great, and I think he'll be a great vice president. He'll be a great vice president, and I think he'll be a great president down the road. Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota, he even did well a few times, at least when the moderators let him speak. But Chris Christie, his tough guy routine, well, that got old very fast. The real overall takeaway, though, from the debate is this. What are we seriously doing here, folks? The primary is essentially over and has been for a long time. Donald Trump will be our nominee in 2024, and that's a very good thing. These candidates have raised and spent a lot of money that can be used to prepare a ground game, start building messaging, and growing the campaign apparatus for our actual nominee, which will be Donald Trump, unless something drastic or unforeseen happens. Now, folks like Haley and Scott, well, they're running to be vice president, and I get it. I don't like it, but I get what they're doing. And Ron DeSantis, he'd be a great vice president as well, like I said. And someday, like I said, I hope to see him in the White House. But my hope is that we can take off our blinders, those few Republicans who seem to think that this isn't over, that is, and consolidate our support around the guy who can win and who will win the primary. Moderates love to try and put squishy candidates in elections that will always end up losing. They always do. These hedge fund Republicans don't actually have a plan to win. In fact, they like to play it safe. It almost seems like they like to lose. They just like sort of being in the area of politics. They like having a minority in the Senate or maybe a minority in the House, and then just, being that opposition in government and then quietly allowing the left to win. They play it safe, and they don't see that Americans are starting to reject leftism, and that's a very good thing. Unfortunately, when you refuse to campaign on the issues, when you refuse to take bold stances on the issues, when conservatives don't put their ideas out there, well, then the voters, they'll reject conservatives. And that's what's been happening in a lot of elections. 2024 can be a victory for us. So let's stop listening to the elites, listening to the hedge fund Republicans. Let's stop doing that. Let's not listen to those squishes who keep losing and losing and losing. Let's buckle down and get serious about making America great again. Third and finally today for Behind the Headlines, Senator Fetterman is one of the oddest individuals to ever occupy the Senate. And of course, we all sympathize with his medical condition. But people are allowed to be quirky, of course. Nothing wrong with being a little bit different. What's really odd is how much of a problem the left makes out of his weirdness. Here's what I mean. You've all probably heard about the Senate dress code controversy. Senator Fetterman shows up to the Senate wearing a hoodie and basketball shorts, which is, of course, against the dress code and is unbecoming of a senator. This makes the news, and Fetterman is in tears because his feelings are hurt. The left says, I don't know why this is such a big deal. Aren't there bigger problems to solve than the dress code? Well, yes, Fetterman dressing like a teenager isn't worse than Biden's economy, but we weren't making it a huge deal like the left claims. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, so to speak. But why is the dress code important? Because it is important. It's because the Senate is less about the individuals in the Senate and more about what it represents. The Senate represents us, the states of the United States of America. We used to revere things that hold great importance. I'm sure wearing shorts and a hoodie to work is more comfortable, but when you are one of 100 senators elected in a country of 330 million people, maybe present yourself as someone who understands the importance of honoring the people and the state that you have the duty and honor of representing in our federal government. Buildings in this country used to be absolutely beautiful, for no immediately apparent utilitarian reason. Old courthouses with fine detail made to look beautiful because the courts exist to do justice, something bigger and grander and more important than the individuals who are elected and appointed to run the mechanism of the judiciary. Our culture has lost its sense of beauty. It's why most modern music is disgusting and soulless, and why modern art has become basically garbage. It's why our country needs to remember what made it great in the first place. And it starts in the home. Teaching the next generation about our founding is the first step to remembering our greatness. So I pray we can figure this out quickly and return our country to its founding principles. And that includes the appreciation of that which is truly good and truly beautiful, things like justice, things that reflect the brilliant beauty of our Creator and reject the sin of man that caused his creation to fall. Now for our deep dive segment. On February 24th, 2022, Russian tanks and troops poured into the Ukrainian heartland, the culmination of an invasion begun back in 2014 that claimed the Crimea and some of Ukraine's easternmost provinces. Biden's response was slow, totally reactionary, just like Obama's was back in 2014. And just like then, the second that Russians set foot on Ukrainian soil, that territory was lost for good. The only hope Ukraine had was to prevent this invasion from going forward in the first place. Biden's weakness dashed that hope. Now, we are on the verge of sinking $135 billion total into a state that is increasingly more autocratic than it is a republic or a democracy. A state that ranks as the second most corrupt in Europe, behind only Russia. A state that has absolutely no hope of winning anything approaching a total victory. We must use what little leverage we have left to bring this war to a close on the best possible terms now, before we lose absolutely all of our leverage. We must prevent further loss of life. Ukraine will lose some territory, and President Biden is to blame. To put this in perspective, let's consider the Lend-Lease aid we sent to the Soviet Union during World War II. From 1941 to 1945, we sent a total of $11.3 billion worth of aid to the communists fighting the Nazi machine. President Roosevelt called it supporting the, quote, enormous and difficult fight against the common enemy, bloodthirsty Hitlerism. That aid would be worth $180 billion in 2020 dollars. We are quickly approaching that number with our aid to Ukraine. But no one would put modern-day Russia into the same category as Nazi Germany. Not in terms of strength, not in terms of their intentions, not in terms of the evil nature of the regime. Simply put, Russia does not even hold a candle to the terrible threat of horrible evil posed by Hitler and his panzers in World War II. So why is Biden essentially treating Russia today as if it is akin to Nazi Germany in World War II, sending that much aid, as if they pose the same kind of danger to America and the free world? On March 26, 2022, while in Poland, President Biden said the conflict was, quote, a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. Well, ever since, Biden's lapdog media has been hammering the point that this conflict between Ukraine and Russia is some sort of end-time struggle between democracy and totalitarianism, between good and evil. But that just isn't true. Sure, Russia is the aggressor, and Russia should never have begun this crusade to conquer Ukraine. Russia is wrong in terms of invading its neighbor and causing this war, that's for sure. But if we are honest, we need to acknowledge that this war didn't start in 2022. It really started the second that the Soviet Union fell. The Ukrainian War of Independence, from March 1917 to November 1921, saw a very brief period of independence for the Ukrainians before Bolshevik troops violently forced Ukraine into the Soviet Union as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic by 1922. Before that, the Ukrainians had enjoyed life under various forms of rule beneath the Russian czars for many centuries, whether they liked it or not. By the 17th century, the concept of Ukraine as Little Russia began to take hold, with many in Russia and in Ukraine seeing the region as a little brother of sorts to Russia. We could turn the next 20 shows into an expose on Russian efforts to keep Ukraine and the Ukrainian region under its sway and the efforts of many but not all Ukrainians to resist. But to keep a very long story short, this conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been brewing with various intensities for hundreds of years. Well, this absolutely and certainly does not absolve Russia of wrongdoing. It does move this conflict over closer to the inevitable column, at least closer to it. It's almost as if there was something artificial and something good preventing this war from happening for the last 30 years, and that good thing was American strength. It is no coincidence that the Russians took pieces of Ukraine under both Obama and Biden, but not Trump or Bush. When America weakened, the Russians took what they have always seen as part of Russia. Again, this by no means absolves Russia of sin. It is merely part of an explanation. And more importantly, it provides a context that most in our current government have been ignoring, probably because it hurts their narrative. That context, especially the historical nature of it, destroys the Biden narrative that if Ukraine loses, well, then the Russians will continue the advance and wildly attack other nations, most likely NATO countries. Even people on our side have bought into this, for example, Lindsey Graham. Add in a few more facts, though, and this large-scale Russian aggression narrative crumbles even further. Consider this. Since the 1990s, Moscow has watched as Russia's economy, which was destroyed by decades of communist planning and malinvestment, shrunk to the size of Italy's. In the current war, the Russian military struggled mightily against the lowly Ukrainians even before Western aid began flowing. And the Russians have watched as NATO has expanded towards its western border over the last 30 years. Along with seeing Ukraine as an integral part of Russia, Russia also sees Ukraine as a buffer zone against NATO, an alliance they know they have no hope of ever defeating. So this war in Ukraine is not some epic clash of civilizations as Biden would have you believe. It is one of an evil but weak dictator attempting to regain a buffer region that his nation has held sway over for centuries. It has nothing to do with democracy and very little to do with American interests. In fact, Ukraine is a rather undemocratic nation. This past summer, Swiss intelligence released a report saying, quote, in his attempt to eliminate Klitschko politically, Zelensky is showing authoritarian traits. Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko is seen by many as Zelensky's biggest rival heading into next year's Ukrainian presidential election. He is the leader of the Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for Reform Party. And interestingly, the party has no stance in Ukrainian NATO membership, something Zelensky would give anything for. The Swiss media says the intelligence report cites credible evidence that Zelensky is trying to rid himself of Klitschko. Maybe Zelensky has been watching Biden and the radical left's desperate attempt to destroy Trump by abusing the criminal justice system. Ulrich Schmid, a professor of Eastern European Studies at the University of St. Gallen, speaking with Swiss newspaper NZZ am Sonntag, asked, quote, what are the prerequisites of a functioning democracy? He then answered his own question, saying, independent parties and a free press. Neither is present in Ukraine at the moment. And he is right. On December 13th, 2022, Zelensky's new media law on media was approved by Parliament. It gives the National Television and Radio Broadcasting Council broad powers over the Ukrainian media. Its members are appointed by the President and the Parliament. The Council will be able to temporarily ban the works of online mass media and demand internet providers block access to online publications without a court hearing, issue binding orders to the editorial offices of media, regulate the work of cable and online television operators, and cancel the registration of print media, among other things, according to the International Federation of Journalists, the IFJ. But this law was not passed in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Interestingly, Zelensky proposed this law way back in 2020. Almost immediately after its passage, the IFJ, the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, the NUJU, and the Independent Media Trade Union of Ukraine, the IMTUU, called on the Ukrainian government to, quote, revise the new legislation and start a broad, inclusive dialogue with journalists, unions, and the media sector. The NUJU warned that free speech was under threat, saying that, quote, the law does not envisage the regulation of the media sphere, but in fact the establishment of relations of subordination when the media becomes under the control of the authorities. The IMTUU said that this law would, quote, create systemic problems with democracy. The Zelensky government has essentially taken over the media in Ukraine, ostensibly under the guise of limiting Russian propaganda and influence during the war, but using a law passed before the war even began. Given that, it is unreasonable to believe that Zelensky and his henchmen will give up their vast powers over the media and work towards a truly free press once the war is over. Authoritarian traits indeed. Okay, what about free and independent political parties? They are an essential component of a functioning republic. Well, Zelensky signed a law in May 2022 that banned political parties with so-called links to Russia. Keep in mind that about 20% of Ukrainians are ethnically Russian. About 30% of Ukrainians speak Russian as their native language as well. One of the banned parties, the opposition Platform for Life, ran second in the 2019 elections and holds 44 seats in the 450-seat Ukrainian parliament. 3 of the suspended parties combined to get almost 3 million votes, around 18% of the total vote in 2019, and were polling around the same collectively in the last polls before the invasion. And these are not right-leaning parties, at least not all of them. At least 2 were left-leaning parties. Back in 2015, Ukraine suspended all the country's communist parties under law number 317-8, the decommunization law. This move was strongly condemned by the Council of Europe's Venice Commission at the time. The commission said, quote, while law number 317-8 may be considered as pursuing legitimate aims, its provisions are not precise enough to enable individuals to regulate their conduct according to the law and to prevent arbitrary interference by public authorities. As such, it does not adhere to the threefold test of legality, legitimacy, and necessity in a democratic society. Furthermore, the law is too broad in scope and introduces sanctions that are disproportionate to the legitimate aim pursued. Any association that does not comply with Law 318-8 may be banned, which is problematic with regard to every individual's freedom of association. This is particularly the case when it comes to political parties, which play a crucial role in ensuring pluralism and the proper functioning of democracy, close quote. So, why, you might be thinking, did I recite that entire lengthy, wordy explanation? Well, because it precisely describes what Zelensky is doing to so-called Ukrainian democracy. Whether it be political parties or the press, he is using a broad brush approach under the guise of fighting Russia to wipe away anything that he and his party do not agree with. And that is the essence of an undemocratic and anti-republican regime. Autocratic leaders find justifications to remove freedoms and suppress discourse that might be a problem for the regime's agenda or its continuation in power. For Zelensky, the war is an opportunity to do what he and his party have always wanted to do. All the people that his not-so-Republican laws target happen to be his political opponents. And let's not forget freedom of religion. That's our nation's first freedom, given pride of place in the First Amendment, and the freedom that really animated our nation's founding. In 2019, religious tension within Ukraine boiled over, resulting in a new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, independent from the Russian Orthodox Church. So now there are 3 churches actively contesting with each other for primacy: the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, and the newly independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Of these, the Moscow Patriarchate is the largest within Ukraine. It separated from the Russian Orthodox Church in 1990, but retains ties to its mother church in Moscow. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, has said that the Ukrainians were pursuing what he saw as a rival church while trying to, quote, make the brotherly peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, enemies. Reverend Cyril Hoverin, an Orthodox priest in Ukraine, was also quoted by the AP saying of the Ukraine conflict, quote, you cannot call it a religious war, but it has a religious dimension. In December of 2022, Zelensky went ahead and banned operations of religious organizations affiliated with centers of influence in Russia. They essentially banned the Russian Orthodox Church and suspect some within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate are actively working with Russia, while others are sympathetic to and pushing the Russian line. And they found evidence of exactly that, exactly what they were looking for. The AP reported in December that the Security Service of Ukraine, that's essentially Ukraine's secret police charged with protecting state security, searched Kiev's Pechersk Lavra monastery complex after a priest spoke favorably about Russia during a service. The Ukrainian Security Service searched over 350 church buildings, including another monastery in a diocese of the Rivne region, which is 150 miles west of Ukraine, of Kiev, rather. So what we have is a three-way religious war of sorts. The government's heavy-handed response is understandable, but not at all in line with the critically important Western value of religious freedom. So we have an undemocratic actor engaged in something that looks a lot like a civil war, this time within the Eastern Orthodox Church and Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity. Someone, please point out the vital American interest in that. But Zelensky wasn't finished being less than democratic. Earlier this year, he told the BBC that elections would only be held after the war. Parliamentary elections are scheduled for October, with a presidential election to be held in March of 2024. Last month, Ukraine's parliament extended martial law by 90 days until November 15th. This conveniently postpones the elections because the Ukrainian constitution prohibits elections under martial law. Zelensky initially declared martial law on February 24th, 2022 for the entire country. The country has been under that harsh condition ever since. Recently, Zelensky said Ukraine could not afford the $135 million cost of holding an election while it is fighting for its very survival. He even suggested that if the West wants an election, then it should pay for it. Many Western officials have been pushing for Ukraine to hold elections. Former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko went even further, saying, quote, "The price of holding elections in wartime will be a lost war. Unity is an indispensable resource for our victory." I guess elections will somehow upset Ukrainian unity. She is also worried about soldiers and refugees living abroad not being able to vote. While Zelensky and Tymoshenko have valid points, Senator Lindsey Graham has the right answer when it comes to the Ukrainian elections. He said, quote, "I cannot think of a better symbol for Ukraine than to hold free and fair elections during the course of a war." Exactly. For once, Lindsey Graham's right. A representative government must be a representative government all the time, not just when it's convenient or easy. Yes, there are challenges to holding an election during wartime, but rising to challenges is one thing real republics do. Did the U.S. cancel its elections during the height of the Civil War in 1864? No. The elections went ahead as planned. So there are many reasons for us to call Ukraine autocratic and anti-democratic, but let's hear from the doctor of democracy himself, one Joseph Biden. Of all people, he should be able to convince us that Ukraine is a functioning democratic republic, right? Let's listen to him speaking about Ukraine joining NATO.
And so I think we can work it out, but I think it's premature to call for a vote, in now, because there's other qualifications that need to be met, including democratization and some of those issues.
What did he say? There's other qualifications that need to be met, including democratization and some of those issues? Did you hear that? The man who has been telling us that the Ukraine war is about protecting democracy just said that Ukraine can't join NATO because of issues with democratization. Well, that's all we need to hear. Ukraine is not a functioning democracy. It's not a functioning republic, but they sure are corrupt. Transparency International's annual Global Corruption Perceptions Index is the worldwide gold standard when it comes to determining just how corrupt a nation's public sector is, or at least that's what many people say. But regardless of how much stock one puts in an international ranking created by some international NGO that probably doesn't have much love for America, the data is still useful insofar as it shows that Ukraine is very near the bottom of the pack when it comes to the perception of corruption. The index is based on data from a large number of sources and ranks the corruption of the public sector from a nation from 0, totally corrupt, to 100, totally clean. So higher is better and less corrupt. The most recent data ranks the United States at 24th, with a score of 69 out of 100. With the Biden crime family in charge, that seems plausible. Ukraine currently sits at 116th of 180 nations, with a score of 33. Russia comes even worse, scoring at 28 with a rank of 137. For comparison, Ethiopia scores 38 and Mexico scores 31. The global average is 43. In January, Zelensky was forced to shake up his entire government as corruption scandals grew out of control. There have been bribery claims, reports of officials buying food at inflated prices, and accusations of public figures living overly lavish lifestyles. 12 high-ranking officials were forced to resign, including a senior advisor, 4 deputy ministers, and 5 regional governors. In fact, just in the first half of this year, there have been 300 cases with 58 indictments, according to Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. And then there are the questions about EU membership. While Ukraine has been given the thumbs up to gain candidate status, the EU has listed 7 reforms that Ukraine must implement before it can happen. So far, Ukraine has complied with 2 of the 7. The most difficult and most important remain. The prevention of money laundering, reducing the influence of oligarchs, and, wait for it, dealing with widespread corruption. Specifically, according to the EU, Ukraine must, quote, further strengthen the fight against corruption, in particular at the high level, through proactive and efficient investigations and an incredible track record of prosecutions and convictions. In June, the most recent EU progress report on Ukraine's reforms stated that the corruption reforms have yet to start. The next report comes in October. If Ukraine does not change, it simply will not join the EU. Now, that's not really a bad thing in my opinion, but in any event, Politico quoted a senior official involved in the January 2023 EU summit in Kyiv who said, "We need a reformed Ukraine. We cannot have the same Ukraine as before the war." And the pre-war Ukraine was a model of corruption, starting the minute the Soviet Union fell. A Ukrainian parliament inquiry concluded that between 1992 and 1998, Ukraine lost $32 billion in military assets through theft. $32 billion through theft, discounted arms sales, and oversight issues. In 1999, they only spent $500 million, one half of $1 billion, on defense legally. I'm sure that this has all stopped now that we are giving them billions upon billions of dollars in weapons and aid, right? Well, CNN recently revealed the Pentagon report concerning arms traffickers selling weapons and ammo stolen from the battlefield in southern Ukraine and criminals posing as aid workers stealing bulletproof vests. Apparently, the report was highly redacted. Of course it was. Anyone with a brain knows that the corruption machine in Ukraine is chomping at the bit to get at all that aid money that's flowing in. We know they are trying. We don't know how successful they are, and I don't think we want to know that. And then there is renowned investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. In one of his Substack articles, he writes how Zelensky and his entourage are skimming and pocketing millions from U.S. aid money earmarked for diesel fuel payments. He cites an estimate from CIA analysts that $400 million in aid money was stolen in 2022 alone. Apparently, the CIA director himself confronted Zelensky about corruption problems during a January meeting in Ukraine. CIA Director Burns gave Zelensky a list of, quote, 35 generals and senior officials whose corruption was known to the CIA and others in the American government, according to Hersh. Zelensky got rid of 10 of the 35 generals. A senior intelligence officer told Hersh, quote, the 10 he got rid of were brazenly bragging about the money they had, driving around in Kyiv with their new Mercedes. As for Ukraine corruption, we could go on and on and on. Let's listen to Rand Paul on the Senate floor last week for just a bit more.
President Zelensky landed in New York earlier this week. We learned that corruption concerns in Ukraine's Ministry of Defense resulted in the firing of 6 deputy defense ministers. This comes 2 weeks after the firing of Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov, who was removed after it was discovered that the Ministry of Defense had mishandled military contracts. Last month, Zelensky fired all 24 regional military recruitment chiefs because they were, quote, involved in illegal activities, including enrichment.
I thought they were supposed to be improving. I guess not. A year and a half into the war, and they are still mass firing people due to corruption? At least we have a special inspector general specifically assigned to watch our aid to Ukraine. Oh, wait.
Lack effective oversight mechanisms to ensure that the hard-earned American tax dollars don't fall prey to waste, fraud, and abuse. For over a year now, I have been asking for a special inspector general to make sure they're not stealing our money. We've had one in Afghanistan, and he and his team of economists and technicians have overseen and found billions of dollars worth of waste that they've saved. We need the same thing in Ukraine, a special inspector general to make sure they're not stealing our money. When that has come before a vote in the Senate, the majority party in here says, no, we just want to spend the money. We don't care. Some Republicans have gone along with this as well, and they have voted against an inspector general.
And to make matters even worse, President Biden is asking for $24 billion more in Ukraine aid to start in fiscal year 2024, which begins October 1st. And lately, the Biden regime was trying to argue leverage Ukraine aid to pressure Republicans to pass a continuing resolution and keep our federal spending at insane levels going forward. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby told CNN recently, quote, not getting that supplemental request if there's a shutdown, that's going to have a significant impact on their ability to succeed on the battlefield. Will it really? Hey, I have an idea. Let's push Ukraine to launch a massive offensive with a significantly inferior force without any air cover into fortified positions that the enemy has been preparing for months. Fail. Big fail. Stupid idea. By all accounts, the Ukrainian offensive, even with all our billions in aid, has done literally nothing to change the situation. $24 billion more won't change anything. The Russians haven't budged, and the Ukrainians have lost huge amounts of men and material that cannot be replaced. Nothing we do will really affect the battlefield much at this point unless we want to do things that will significantly widen the war to include NATO and risk thermonuclear war. So why is Biden still intent on throwing billions at an autocratic, corrupt regime that has no chance to win, a war that has more in common with the Civil War than it does the official Biden narrative of some epic clash to save democracy? That is the $135 billion question. But there is a simple answer to all of this. It is time to conclude the best end to this war that we possibly can. No matter which side of the Ukraine question a person is on, no one can say that we have not done our fair share. That, plus the facts that Ukraine cannot push the Russians out, are becoming less democratic by the day, and showcase their corruption on a weekly basis, should be enough to turn off the spigot. Add in how weak the Russian military has shown itself to be, in the historical context we spoke of earlier, and there is exactly no reason to send another dime to Ukraine. Russia is not going to attack NATO, period. There is no next domino to fall. Any domino that does fall is far more likely to fall back on Russia itself after this debacle. To even a casual observer, the Russian military has not performed well. Its conventional forces are in desperate need of a complete overhaul, from training to tactics, equipment, you name it. They have serious problems across the board. But there is still the small matter of their 5,977 nuclear weapons. Those still work, or at least enough of them do, to destroy the entire world. And our first concern when it comes to Russia should be keeping those weapons unexploded in their silos and submarines and out of the hands of terrorists. I'm sure the fact that Biden wants to send Ukraine long-range missiles will help cooler heads prevail in that regard, right? Those missiles, 300-kilometer range, surely won't widen the war by allowing Ukraine to target Russian military deep within Russia itself, right? Maybe Biden wants a war with Russia. What else could explain his hopeless obsession with saving Ukraine's so-called democracy? What he should be doing is exerting as much pressure as possible on all parties right now to broker a peace. Now. The war is over, the damage has been done, the front lines are not going to move much, and Ukraine will lose territory. The only concern now should be to end the bloodshed and prevent anything that could possibly widen this war. It is time to cut everyone's losses. For Biden and Zelensky, that means admitting to a partial defeat. It's a partial defeat for Russia, too. This is all more proof that showing strength is important in leadership. We just don't have any real strong leadership right now, and we haven't since Donald Trump was president. Oh, and there may come a day in the not-so-distant future when we wished that the $135 billion in aid went towards countering a real present threat, the Chinese Communist Party. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're honored to be coming to you on Lindell TV. If you're watching on any other platform or listening to the audio podcast, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. Give us a 5-star rating into the podcast. Like the video. Drop a comment in the comment section. Doing all those things helps us tremendously. And one more thing. The CCP must be destroyed.